hopefully we're glad to be benevolent and do according to what God has directed here and release these people from their debts. You know, we talk a lot about income inequality in this country. And, you know, it is true that oftentimes the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and the bigger gap, you know, is a problem. And I got to thinking about it. Every 50 years, God kind of did this reset. And the solution was not coercion, like in communism and in some aspects of socialism. The solution was voluntary philanthropy. And hopefully, if somebody understands it's more blessed to give than to receive, they can celebrate for the joy of all these people as well. At least that's the ideal, I think. So, any other thoughts about that? Yes, Lyle.
The value of the property went down based on the number of yields of agriculture they could pull off the land in the years. So every year the value would be less and kind of depreciate. So if you were selling it, you would only be able to sell it for what the value was for the coming years' harvest, multiple harvests that they had coming up.
Okay, so when you get... Yeah. Yeah, well, my understood is they also took it into consideration when the Jubilee year was coming. It's also unfortunate that it doesn't look like for most of their history they even followed this provision, which they should have. I think they did the very first Jubilee from what we can tell, but oftentimes Josephus says they did not. Or at least some people did, some people didn't. But, you know, you can see what God's plan was, and it's just really interesting how he wanted to give everybody a second chance, and we serve a God of second chances. And that's something we can celebrate and live with even today as we get the benefit of forgiveness. Okay, so let's look at the necessity of moral purity and these holiness codes that is going to help them to be separate from the rest of the people. In Leviticus 20, at the end of this list, he says at the end of verse 24, I am Jehovah your God who has separated you from the peoples to be mine. And then in 20:27, he talks about, 26, you shall be holy unto me, for I, Jehovah, am holy and have set you apart from the peoples that you should be mine. So he repeats this over and over again. So keep that in mind as we go through this. All right, and in Leviticus 18, 1 through 4, he says, I am Jehovah your God, after the doings of the land of Egypt, wherein ye dwell, you shall not do. So, are they going to have a hard time going back to a lot of things they learned in Egypt? Yeah, what are they worshiping when Moses is up on Mount Sinai? You know, the golden calf. Where'd they get that? From Egypt, you know. So, he says, don't do these things you picked up among the Egyptians, particularly these things that are immoral and associated with worshiping these Egyptian gods. And he says, and don't follow the doings of the land of Canaan, where I bring you, you shall not do, neither shall you walk in their statutes, but of course in mine. Mine ordinances shall ye do, and my statutes shall ye keep to walk therein. For I am Jehovah your God. He just repeats that over and over again. So he says this 40 times in the book of Leviticus. And he says, I've separated you from the world, basically. So we often talk about being called out of darkness, being called out of the world so we can glory in Jehovah and his marvelous light and testify to other people of his excellencies, the New Testament says. And so that certainly is parallel, that we're supposed to be separate from the world in so many ways so that we can be a magnet to others who are looking for an alternative from the wicked world, the aimless world that is all around them. So he does something in the rest of this chapter. I don't think it's really worth reading through all these specifics, but he enters in some new provisions here that have not necessarily always be considered immoral. For example, why in the garden was incest not prohibited? Yeah, I mean, at some point, if you start off with two people, you're going to have to marry a very, very close relative along the way, right? I mean, where did Cain get his wife? People always ask that. Well, at some point, somebody had to marry their sister, I would think. And that was just the way it was. You didn't have any other options. And in fact, after the flood, you've only got Noah, Mrs. Noah, and their 3 kids, and their wives. And so then they have children. So you're going to have to, at some point, to repopulate the earth, marry some pretty close relatives, right? In order to make that happen. So, God understood that. But now, things are different. Now, he says, you're not supposed to be marrying close kin anymore. So he makes these new provisions. And he's going to specifically, I think, interestingly enough, make a provision in Leviticus 18 and verse 18 where he says, thou shalt not take a wife to her sister and be a rival to her to uncover her nakedness, at least as long as the other lives. So what did Jacob do? Who did he marry? Yeah, 2 sisters. God says, we're not going to do that anymore. That's not going to be allowed anymore. Now, if one of them dies and you've only got one left, then that's an exception. But, Rachel and Leah, after Leviticus 18, that's not even considered acceptable any longer. So there's some additional things that he says in regards to things that would be considered immoral and incestuous. There's a big deal made about, respecting your father's wife. And, that was something that during the time of David, Adonijah, it says, went and laid with his father's concubines and embarrassed and humiliated David throughout all the nation. And so that was a specific provision here against the law. It says here in verse 10, you're not supposed to, have any kind of sex with your grandchildren, obviously, with your aunt, with your uncle, with your daughter-in-law. Now, there was an exception. I thought this was interesting. In verse 16, it says, thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife, for it is thy brother's right, not yours. And yet, what happens if your brother is widowed? What happened then? If you're not married and say your older brother dies, then according to the kinsman redeemer law in Deuteronomy 25, beginning at verse 5, what were you supposed to do? Yeah, you're supposed to marry your older brother's widow and then raise up seed so the name of your brother would remain in Israel. So that was an exception. But generally speaking, shouldn't be, marrying your sister-in-law, obviously. So that's just kind of part of this new code, and we have this in our culture. And of course, what practical reason is there? Not only is the whole thought of that, a lot of these things to me are just kind of gross, but what practical reason is there, do we know, that it's not a very good idea to marry very close relatives? Yes, Cassandra. Yeah. You got this issue of, recessive genes, and you're more likely to have birth defects and problems if you marry too close in the family. In fact, the royal family of England, hundreds of years ago, I think the Tudor line of kings, they wanted to keep the royalty sort of close within the family, and they wound up for generation after generation having hemophilia. And that was passed on, that genetic defect, because of their tendency to marry too close within their own family. So there's some practical purposes here, but he's basically saying this is now considered immoral. Of course, in verse 20, he says that you've got an issue here, of course, with adultery, which is just repeating the 7th commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. It's interesting to me how there may be other sins, but adultery is mentioned in each one of the books of the Pentateuch: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. In each case, adultery is forbidden. It's just something God wanted to make sure people got. And it is under the old law, it was a capital crime to be caught committing adultery. And then in chapter 18:21, it also forbids a practice that was particularly common among the Moabites and their false god Molech and Chemosh, where they would offer their seed or their children to the fire, which was a part of their pagan sacrifice. And he says in 18:21, thou shalt not give any of thy seed to make them pass through the fire to Molech, neither shalt thou profane the name of thy God, for I am Jehovah. So even considering doing that kind of thing as a child of Israel was one way you could profane God's name. He found it so horrific. Let's skip over for a minute to Leviticus 20:1-5. And Jehovah spake unto Moses, saying, moreover, thou shalt say to the children of Israel, whoever he be of the children of Israel, or of the strangers that sojourn in Israel, that giveth of his seed unto Molech, he shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. I also will set my face against that man, and will cut him off from among the people that defile my sanctuary and profane my holy name. Then he goes on to say that if the people of the land do at all hide their eyes from that man, when he giveth of his seed unto Molech, and put him not to death, then I will set my face against that man and against his family, and will cut him off, and all that play the harlot after him, to play the harlot with Molech from among their people. So he says, first of all, this is so serious that you would kill one of your own offspring in this terrible sacrifice to this pagan god. I don't even understand what would be tempting about that. You know, certain things I understand would be a temptation. That I don't get. But he says, first of all, you shouldn't do it. And second of all, if the nation sees other people do it and they don't stand up and deal with it, then they're going to be held accountable as well. Okay, go ahead, Mitchell.
In Jeremiah and in Ezekiel, both of those prophets point out that the people were doing this. They were offering human sacrifice.
Yes.
And God says, this didn't even occur to me. This never was in my mind. It was never something that I wanted to happen. And evidently the people there in the 600 BC time frame were doing that in Jerusalem.
Yes.
It's just appalling.
It is appalling. In fact, Manasseh, the statement is made, one of the reasons why God said, I'm going to take you into captivity, enough is enough, is because he shed innocent blood. And a part of that, I think, was this kind of activity. And, you know, I don't think it's too far of a stretch to say that if someone maybe out of, you know, just a sense of convenience, they get pregnant and they have a baby and they want to just go and abort it, isn't that a form of child sacrifice? Seems to me. I mean, pretty serious stuff here as far as God's attitude toward shedding innocent blood. And Mitchell's right. The prophets came out after these people saying, what are you doing? You know, and it's one of the reasons why the nations were taken into captivity. Also, homosexuality is forbidden. Someone like to read Leviticus 18:22. Someone gonna thank you, Chris, for carrying the mic. Appreciate it.
18:22. You shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It is an abomination.
Okay, and so again, in the Bible, this is like any other sin. It's a choice. It's not something that you're born with. You can't help. This is a choice, and even if someone has that temptation, they can choose not to act upon it. Just like if someone is tempted to commit adultery, they need to choose not to act upon that temptation. Same idea. So very clearly here, homosexuality is forbidden. You know, I was reading this text and several other passages about this to someone a while back who had no idea that homosexuality was wrong. In fact, he told me he thought it was cool. And I said, no, it's not cool. I said, let me show you what the Bible says about that. So we started with Sodom and Gomorrah, we read that, and we got to this. And when he learned that it was an abomination before God, he immediately stopped me and said, wow, I didn't know that. I had no idea. I'm sorry. He said, I am never going to have anything to do with that again. And I just appreciated that spirit, that tender heart. And I also am amazed at how things that throughout history have been understood to be immoral, we now live in a world where so many people don't even know. And so it's even more important than ever that we teach people the truth about these things. And of course, bestiality is forbidden. And verse 23, and thou shalt not lie with any beast to defile therewith, neither shall any woman stand before a beast to lie down therewith. It is confusion. Some translations say it is perversion. In what way would that be confusion? A lot of these things, a man lying down with a man as if she were a woman, it's confusion, it says in the text. So what's confusing about that?
It's not natural.
Okay, it's unnatural. It isn't the natural order of things. It isn't what God intended. And to other people that may witness those things, it's just confusing to them. And so this is a really clear chapter in Leviticus that deals with just a whole host of things. I found this afternoon, 10 nationalities who fornicate with animals. This was an article from January 10th, 2016, and it talks about bestiality in many countries is illegal, but there are groups who are dedicated toward protecting the rights of people to have sex with animals. It has only been within the last 5 years that countries such as Sweden, Denmark, and a handful of the states in the U.S. finally outlawed the practice. This surprised me. Studies have estimated, according to self-surveys, 4.9% of men and 1.9% of women have engaged in bestiality. Dogs come in at the number one choice, followed by horses, donkeys, and sheep. So this isn't something that was just done among the Canaanites and done sometimes in the very low point of the nations of Judah and Israel, but actually is becoming more prevalent now. My understanding is especially in Germany, they've opened up some animal brothels, they call it. And it's in some sections of Germany, it's not illegal. And so, you know, if you turn away from God and you become a secular culture and you don't really know right from wrong, this is the kind of thing that happens. Now, my judgment is that what we've seen since the 1960s is a constant, you know, slide downhill morally, where things that used to be considered, everyone would agree was immoral, is fine, and then you continue to go down. And in our culture, after we have just basically trumpeted and celebrated homosexuality, the next thing that happens culturally is pedophilia. That becomes more acceptable. And then after that, you've really scraped the bottom of the barrel when you go to bestiality. I mean, there just isn't anything lower than that morally, it seems to me. And that has happened in other cultures. And God says here, when it happened among the Canaanites, that was the end. You go in and you wipe that culture out and let's start from scratch. And when the nation of Judah and Israel, Judah especially, this is mentioned, gets involved in these kind of things, God says, enough. I'm going to give you the bitter pill of captivity, and we're going to see if maybe the next generation doesn't learn to do better when they recognize why they've lost their nation and all the wonderful blessings that they had. And so it's hard to believe that anybody could possibly defend this. But in some cases, that's exactly what is happening. All right, so you got the necessity of moral purity. He told them that they'd been given the land because the Canaanites had defiled it. Remember, the reason they had to wait in Egypt was because the wickedness of the Amorite, a term for the Canaanites, had not yet been made full. In other words, they didn't deserve, it wasn't just to drive them out like this. And then he says, if you continue to do these things, like what the Canaanites did, just as I vomited them out of the land, I will send someone else in to vomit you out because of your sins. So let's go ahead and read this. Leviticus 18, beginning at verse 24, if you want to follow along. He says, defile not yourselves at any of these things, for in all these the nations are defiled, which I cast out from before you. And the land is defiled, therefore I do visit the iniquity therefore upon it, and the land vomited out her inhabitants. In other words, just all this awful sin, this depravity just made me sick. He said, ye therefore shall keep my statutes and mine ordinance, and shall not do any of these abominations, neither the homeborn nor the stranger that sojourneth among you. For all these abominations have the men of the land done that were before you, and the land was defiled. And that the land vomit not you out also when you defile it, as it vomited out the nation that was before you. For whosoever shall do any of these abominations, even the souls that do them, shall be cut off from among their people. And this includes homosexuality as well as bestiality. They're all wrapped up as abominations before God. So, is it possible that God can bring judgment against these United States? Bring us to our knees because of our nation's immorality? Sure. And I think perhaps the only reason he hasn't done so thus far is because of the good grains of salt and the Christians that are here that are trying to make a difference. And so he's long suffering, I think, in large part, oftentimes simply because of good, solid Christians who are the salt of the earth. And as I said, they're warned if they repeat these abominations, they will be vomited out also. This is the significance of what happened during the days of Ahab and Jezebel. Would someone like to read 1 Kings 21:26? 1 Kings 21:26. Someone got that ready? Chris is getting his exercise tonight. Good for you, Chris. Thanks for helping out. Okay, Gene King, go ahead and read that to us, please.
1 Kings 21:26.
Yes.
He acted very abominably in following idols, according to all that the Amorites had done, whom the Lord cast out before the sons of Israel.
Okay, so this is sort of like why Israel was taken captive. During the time of Ahab and Jezebel, not only were they worshiping Baal, but they were involved in these different abominations that the Canaanites were. The Canaanites were cast out, and now Israel is committing some of those very same things. And then also in 2 Kings 21, verses 9 through 11, when it talks about the sins during the reign of Manasseh, it says, but they hearkened not to the word of the prophets, and Manasseh seduced them to do that which was evil more than did the nations whom Jehovah destroyed before the children of Israel. So, under the time of Judah and Manasseh, the Jews were worse than the Canaanites. And Jehovah spake by the servant and the prophet, saying, because Manasseh king of Judah hath done these abominations, and hath done wickedly above all that the Amorites did that were before him, and hath made Judah also to sin with his idols. Therefore just Jehovah said, I will bring evil upon Jerusalem and Judah, so much so that when everyone heareth it, it will cause their ears to tingle. You won't believe the devastation and judgment I'm going to bring because of these abominations. So there is reason to fear when we see people all around us celebrating and engaging in these things that the Bible says are abominable. Any thoughts about that? Yes, Lance.
I guess you can just see the decline of any nation when they start taking God and his commandments out of their life and start implementing their own choices of mankind.
Yep.
And it just, it's really starting to show in this country where no one even wants to mention God or support him. It's like,
Or in any way be God-fearing. They want to take God completely out of our thinking and act like those of us that believe in God are some sort of Neanderthals that, want to spend time talking to what they refer to as our imaginary friend. It's really unfortunate. It just makes us even more determined to try to show the love of Christ and show a better moral way and be more evangelistic. That's the best thing that our nation needs is not just, more people going to the voting booth, though that might help, but is just spread basic morality and spread the gospel so that people will be internally what they ought to be. I mean, I want people to be convicted of the sanctity of life and not want to involve themselves in abortion because in their heart of hearts, they don't want to be a part of that. Not just because it's become illegal. Because you can't really legislate morality anyway. And we just need to keep that in mind. And part of morality, though, is not just maintaining your sexual mores in the right way, but part of morality is having compassion toward the poor. And what is one of the ways in God's plan you took care of the indigent around you? What was the provision according to Leviticus 19, 9 and 10? As you go out and you're harvesting your crops, when you reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not what? Wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. Thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather the fallen fruit of thy vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and for the sojourner, for I am Jehovah your God. And so don't pick it all up for yourself. Save it for those people who, I guess, in today's modern vernacular, oftentimes would be homeless and don't have land of their own or provisions by which they can eat otherwise. Of course, chapter 19, verse 11, you shall not steal, neither shall you deal falsely, nor lie one to another, which is just, again, repeating the principles of the Ten Commandments. And then he says, you shall not misuse God's name or use it falsely and profane the name of thy God. That is forbidden. And remember, a big part of this misusing God's name is doing evil in his name. Someone's going to do something that's clearly wrong, and, well, I prayed about this, and so I feel good about this, and trying to make God the reason for doing evil. You do something in God's name that's wrong. That's a way to misuse it. It's a form of profanity as well as just using the name flippantly. All right. And then he says in verse 13, thou shalt not oppress thy neighbor or hold back the wages of a hired servant. If somebody's living hand to mouth, and at the end of the day they need their pay, you need to make sure they get paid. Shall not abuse the handicapped, those that are blind or deaf among you. Do not put a stumbling block before them. He says, shall not be a respecter of persons, either of the rich or for the poor. You just judge rightly. And be careful that you're not a talebearer or a gossip. That is also forbidden. One of the key things about morality in this section, and this is so important because the foundation of Western civilization has been the Judeo-Christian ethic. And a lot of it is based upon these very principles. So one of the keys to morality is how we treat one another, which is exactly, of course, what Jesus talks about in the New Testament. And it's not just in the New Testament, however. He says, verse 17, thou shalt not hate thy brother in thy heart. And he says, thou must surely rebuke thy neighbor and not bear sin because of him. So if you see evil being done in your neighborhood, then you need to stand up. He also says, however, you should not take vengeance nor bear a grudge, but still wish a blessing upon everyone, because vengeance belongs not to you, but to whom? To God. It says, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, which Jesus quoted as the what? Second greatest commandment. So that's where these commandments are drawn from. And Jesus thought this was one of the things upon which all the law and the prophets hang. Okay, any thoughts about this? Okay. Now, this next section, which we're really not going to have time to get into with the fact we get to have the pleasure of a baptism soon, but he says, you shall keep my statutes. He begins a new section in 1919 showing the importance of keeping God's moral and physical order sacred. He says, don't mix these things that were separated in creation. So the Israelites were to abstain from all unnatural, idolatrous, and pagan conduct. Now, some of these things seem odd to us. Part of it's because there's a mixture of the civil and the religious, and there's not really, a need in that day to separate those two. And secondly, we're not familiar with the pagan practices that they dealt with in Egypt, where they came from, as well as the Canaanite practices. But surely some of these things that he's about to say are relevant to don't do anything that even looks like it's pagan worship, like boiling a kid in its mother's milk, which was, they have a lot of archaeological discoveries that have demonstrated that that's one of the things the Canaanite peoples did in their rituals. So they're told not to do that. So I don't think that's anything that's inherently wrong to have milk and meat together, but it was something that was associated with idolatry, and so they shouldn't do it. So the Holy Spirit begins by shifting into the realms of nature. It says you must not sow your field with two different kinds of seeds. Is there some practical benefit to that command from an agrarian, agricultural perspective? The farmers today usually have a whole crop of corn or a whole crop of soybeans rather than trying to grow them both together. Yeah, there's reasons for that. I'm told that in some cases, neither will survive if they try to grow up together for different reasons. But he says, don't sow your field with two different kinds of seed. These people were slaves in Egypt. They worked for the Egyptians, and probably the Egyptians fed them for their labor. So they aren't farmers. They haven't done this before, in my judgment. They came out of the wilderness. They got manna and quail. So some of this makes sense. Some of it may simply be just another way of saying, I want you to be different than everybody else. You must not wear clothing made from two different kinds of material, particularly linen and wool. Again, I don't know if there's any practical reason for that, except that he's saying, I want you to keep these things separate. And they were not to breed two different kinds of cattle, whether it be a horse and a she-ass or a he-ass and a cow, as was often done in the East. So you don't couple a donkey and an ox together, for example. This is something that would be considered unnatural, was designed to discourage unnatural and forbidden lust previously condemned. And then finally, he says you don't breed two different kinds of cattle, which we just mentioned. They must not sow your field with two different kinds of seed. Sow oats and wheat together. The latter would be injured and the former ruined, according to Deuteronomy 22:9. I understand the turnip and the carrot cannot succeed if they grow up together. So these are probably some prudent agricultural maxims, but also just different ways that you could be different, that God wanted them to stand out. So, all right, I think we ought to end right here, and we'll pick up here next Wednesday, the Lord willing. And this will be an opportunity for us to baptize Travis. Stacy, nice to have you here. I heard you were going to come to witness the baptism. You probably want to come up front so you can get a better view. The baptistry's up here. Looking forward to meet you. And Travis, if you could come forward, I'm going to go ahead and take the good confession right now.